Okay, class. So we are in our second unit of our course on literature and translation, our world literature course, right? Working specifically on the unit dealing with Du Fu, as the text we're looking at is Du Fu: A Life in Poetry, translated by David Young. Kind of a collected selection of a number of his poems from across his lifespan, kind of tying it to specific points and major acts of his life as determined by the editor and David Young as a translator and compiler, right? We've come to this coming from Basho, who was distinctly and very definitively influenced by Du Fu, as were many people who were writing in both the Japanese and Chinese literary spaces that came around and after Du Fu in particular, which we'll talk a bit about, right? And we're also going to talk in detail kind of about him in this first lecture. Then there'll be another one that goes into some aesthetic and translation concerns that are unique to not just Du Fu, but also historical Chinese translation, right? And then we'll go into another lecture that's very particularly about the poems themselves, right? So it'll be broken up into 3 lectures like last time, or a number of lectures like last time. Go through them at your pace, right? I'm also going to be uploading a number of scans from a book that I have desperately been spending most of the week trying to get my hands on from either a library or elsewhere. Usually, obviously, I'd want to have these up a lot earlier in the week, but it was a very hard to find out of print textbook. I got a newer printing of something similar that I paid out of pocket for. It wasn't quite what I was looking for, but close, right? I might put up some scans from it in the future. But I was able to find some handouts from when I was in undergrad, tore my apartment up until I finally found them. Because if I wanted to get the original textbook, it's about $1,000, which is not something that I can just do. But thankfully, scans from an older professor of mine I can absolutely handle. So I'm going to upload those for your interest in reading in relation to kind of closing out this unit moving forward. They deal a lot with what we'll talk about in the second lecture, which is the complications and philosophies behind kind of the interpretation in relation to kind of the aesthetics and general relationship between reader, writer, greater meaning, and the work itself when interpreting Chinese literature. Okay, but for this first part, we're going to talk about Du Fu as a person. Just kind of try and fit him into a historical context comparative to things that we're familiar with more commonly Anglosphere and American Anglosphere understanding of literature, and kind of just put into context how momentous Du Fu's writing career really is in a literary historical sense. Okay. Beyond that, just try to get a grapple on something that we're going to talk about a lot more when we come back around to talking about very ancient writings again in 2 sections, but particularly when we come back around to East Asia a little later in the semester when we return to Japan with the Kojiki, which is namely the complications that come from time and in distinct changes in a language over time that come from translation, where the linguistic hurdles become complicated, and in Du Fu's case, particularly in a understanding of Chinese criticism and philosophical ideas over the development of China, how the interpretation of his poetry can change. Okay, so we'll unpack that a little bit again later in the semester, but we're going to touch on it in the second lecture as well. So we're going to start off, like I said, talking about Du Fu as a person, right? A poet, a human being that lived in the 8th century, right? We're talking a long damn time ago, right? Nearly, 1,300 some odd years ago, closer to 1,600, mid 700s, ACE. born to a politically connected family in China, right? There's some interesting notes that we need to unpack a bit about how culturally things were expected to run that will tie into the aesthetics. So we'll get into those in a second. But the most important thing is that he was essentially heading into government, right? There was this idea that you were, if you were farming and things like that, that was one thing, but you were also expected, people of means were expected to go and take imperial service exams, essentially, right? Namely, that you would need to be essentially given essentially a standardized test, right, to see what you would best be able to do for the government, right? What type of bureaucrat are we going to make you? And it was very meritocracy based, and we'll kind of unpack that a little bit, right? As a person, right, he went into government, kind of flunked out of it and hated it. Didn't fit in well with the capital, at least early in life. He does come back around to the court later in life, but essentially flunked out and was courted by the life of essentially the hermit poet, right? Let's just go write poetry and hang out in nature and live a peaceful life, right? A bunch of rebellion and military conflict does upset the great, course of his life, as it does everyone in the regions involved at the time. And that's very much reflected in his work, right? He was unknown early, right? Just you need to think a little bit about the difficulty of proliferation of, text, like 1,300 years ago versus hell, even in the 90s and God forbid compared to now, right? Something is much easier to proliferate now than it was then, and we're talking like pre-printing, like not as easy mass printing. You have a lot of transcription of things being passed around, so it was very difficult to kind of become known, but he was later in life and more distinctly after his passing, right, very well known outside of his particular sphere of influence as a poet of incredible note, right? He's often considered one of, if not the best of the Chinese poets, right? The other name that's often kind of in dueling contention with him is of his mentor and great friend and great influence and contemporary, Li Bao. You might remember that we mentioned Li Bao and Du Fu both when we talked about Basho, right? Du Fu's writings very much influenced Basho's, particularly in the Haibun and the travel log sort of thing, which we'll look at a couple examples from in the book. But also, if you remember, Basho got to choose a number of names for himself over his life, and his first one that he attempted to choose for himself, Tosei, right, was a play specifically on Li Bao, right? And in what they translates to, it's both a fruit and a color. I don't remember off the top of my head what Tosei was, right? But a peach and white, I think, is Li Bao, or peach and blue, one of the two. This comparison point. He wanted to be akin to what had come before, right? These two voices were very indicative of shaping just tidal waves of influence through both Chinese and Japanese literature, and indeed through much of East Asia around it, just because of how such a standardized and centralized Chinese existence often made it easier for linguistic traditions to roll off of them to neighboring cultures. Let's see. So he's been very prominent historically, right? Just comes up a whole bunch in Chinese and Japanese literature all through history, is very well regarded over a millennia of influence, right? Not as commonly talked about as you might understand, given that I doubt many of you have heard of him in Western circles, right? There's a bunch of reasons for this, not the least of which is, of course, just general white supremacy, but as just a negating factor of anything that comes before, but more specifically kind of an Anglocentrism. Besides the fact that we call, our literature classes English classes, and we primarily read things that are in English, right? Some of it comes from the Francophone space, the French-speaking world, but generally speaking, we're looking at Western European and then colonized English voices in former colonies, right? Is what's really commonly taught in the English canon, right? Particularly in American English, right? And British English accordingly, right? That does not leave a lot of room for the voices that come from elsewhere, and it did not fit our incredibly narrow understanding of what were the greats, right? We have, 1,600 years of Dufu out here just, kicking ass and taking names when it comes to influence. But who the hell got to read Dufu in high school, right? Especially in the States, right? So it's interesting and it's problematic, and it's something that English as an academia is trying to grapple with. There's a lot of pushback within the existing academia to that. But it's something we're trying to crack, right? Younger voices are coming up and really just rattling the tree against, it's stupid that we don't read these translated things. And the argument is, well, they're not really in English and something is lost in translation, so they can't be the greats in English. I disagree, right? And I'm eager to see how you feel about it at the end of the semester. It's something I'm going to ask you about directly in later assignments. But can these things be great even in translation, right? I think yes, right? They definitely have a power and a potency, and it's something that I think and hope that the texts we've chosen this semester help you guys start to grapple and think about, right? There's definitely complications, but that doesn't mean there can't be greatness that comes out of that as well. So we talked already about prominence across history. He's been compared to a whole damn slew of the English-speaking greats, Shakespeare and this and that and the other, just bam, 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 the great poets, all the way up through the canon of English and French, intermingling that pops up in the English canon. He's been compared against nearly all of them that come from way later than him. So it's very interesting, right? As I said, he came from a political family, went and took the civil service exam, flunked out. That civil service exam, like I said, was just this idea that if you came from a family, you could study and go take the test and have a role within the bureaucracy of of Imperial China. Very, very ostensibly focused on meritocracy, right? Namely, you take the test, and depending on how well you do on the test, you should be promoted to a particular thing, right? Obviously, that is an ideal. There was plenty of, networking and bribery and corruption that almost certainly played into this, right? But in the ideal of as it was described and designed, it should be something that is ostensibly a meritocracy, right? There are plenty of speculations as to why he failed out. The one that amuses me the most is that his writing was too dense, which is he was supposed to be a poet and not like a postman. So I'm not surprised that his writing was a little too flowery and dense. The other one that gets brought up a lot is that he did a very poor job of making friends in the capital. He didn't network well enough to have people on his side when he's being, tested to kind of argue for his position. And he pokes fun at himself about that in a couple poems we'll talk about later. So he fails the exam. He meets Li Bai, right? Already an existent poet, one that's known and respected, but he meets him and is immediately enamored with not only poetry and Li Bai's poetry and Li Bai's philosophies of poetry and influence, but also just the idea of how Li Bai lives his life, right? Just this reclusive poet artist, the eccentric poet artist that lives off on their own in harmony with nature, right? And just in a rural space, you leave the hustle and bustle of the capital and you go out into the world, right? And you write. So very fascinating, very, very formative to how he writes. And we'll talk about that as we go into the poems. Few major events over the course of his life that are of import, right? Perhaps the most important one is the Anlushan Rebellion. So 1755, 54-ish, right? Starts him writing a lot of war poetry, right? We'll talk about this as we go, but it's a very long-standing tradition in poetry to write out of war. We write out of things that impose strong emotional impact on us, right? And I think this is the most interesting comparison point, next to, say, Basho, right? Who's writing much more out of, to me, despite the influence that's very obvious from Du Fu in shaping and in progression and strict rules, right? But the focal points, right? That very Shinto Japanese focus on the world around you and how it's making you feel, and crystallizing a moment of nature in reverence is interesting, especially coming off of Du Fu's writing, which is written in a very Taoist, Confucianist, Buddhist existence, which has a lot more ancestor veneration rather than natural veneration, but also via Taoism has this inherent push for a connection to nature. But in Du Fu's case, to me, it much more manifests in empathy to his fellow man around him, right? To his fellow just people living their lives. He writes a lot about what's happening around him to other people, to young men going to war and coming back as old men just to be sent back to war, right? He does not think highly of war, right? Perhaps unsurprising, but we get this idea very often that gets brought up a lot, for example, in context of the Greatest Generation, the World War II and World War I, this idea that, like, everyone knew we had to go and do this, right? It's like, yes, right, like, there was a great push to go fight back against, some of the greatest evils of mankind, but also there was an understanding, oftentimes demonstrated through the arts, and woefully slow to be developed in greater society, of the impact that this leaves on people. You had the modernists like Virginia Woolf already writing about what we come to know as PTSD, but shell shock and all number of names it used to have, affecting people who came back from World War I, and just society expecting them to go back to normal, right? The machine of a country continues to run, and people are put through the grinder, right? And it imbues great emotional and physical scars on not just the people who have to fight, but the people who love them. Du Fu dives a lot into that. It's not something that we really see Basho tackle as much, right? And I think a lot of that comes from circumstance, but also focal points in what was being particularly venerated and explored, right? This fascination with the natural and the moment and the reflection thereon, versus a very Confucian idea and a Taoist idea of harmony and empathy, right? And Du Fu was very famously, and I think it comes through in his poetry, very empathetic. He cared a lot about the people around him and what they were going through. Oftentimes, some critics would actually start to characterize him as almost like selfish, because he talks about his like minor shit that's happening in his life, but a lot of, just as many, if not more, critics say, well, the point is he's trying to point out how minor his concerns are compared to the people around him. Like, you have little things that happen and they bother you, but like, people are suffering actual trauma, right? And that point of comparison, like the minor troubles of a lower end court diplomat versus, like, my son didn't come back from war, like the sheer kind of lunacy of putting those next to each other, the strangeness of it kind of highlights the disparity of the effect of what's lost, right? So that rebellion shapes a lot of his, not just his writing, but his life, right? He tries to go and court what becomes essentially like an interim government, gets captured, gets taken to court, goes in and out of court, stands up a whole lot for people in ways that make him very unpopular in court, and gets arrested for it, and then eventually kind of like pardoned. And he plays politics either poorly or fantastically, depending on how you feel about what you think his goals were, right? He's there for the people he cares about a lot of the time. beyond just the hardships of this, he had medical hardships over life. He's one of the first people we have historically documented that was a sufferer of diabetes, right? He was diabetic. He also contracted malaria during his life, I believe during the rebellion period when he was moving around. And then as he gets older, when he wastes away, as so many people have done over history, from pulmonary tuberculosis. His lungs just essentially suffocate him to death, right? And he dies around 58 years old on a boat on the Yangtze River. What's most interesting, I think, to contextualize here, right, is that we have over 1,500 of his poems that have survived to the modern era, right? That's a lot of poems, right? And that's particular poems, not, pages and things like that. It was a piece, like 1,500 individual pieces. Compare that with someone like, who we're going to talk about next unit, Pablo Neruda, who has, over 3,000 pages of poetry that have, come forth to the modern era. But he's writing in the 20th century, right? And this is from, 1,300, 1,400 years ago. It's incredible, right? And a large part of that comes from the centralization and then venerate the centralization of Imperial China, right? And then the veneration of this work as it's kind of existed throughout literary and cultural history, right? The poet, and then Du Fu specifically as kind of what he was described as a poet sage, right? Like someone who's imparting wisdom through the poetics, is culturally, he's bedrock, right? He's put on par or in conversation with Confucius himself very often, which is a very big deal, right? He's the counterpart. Like, Confucius says these things, and now we can look to Du Fu's writing to show how to be a good Confucian, right? So definitely fascinating, right? 1,500 of these over a millennia of writing. Like, the idea to have that much of the work is astounding. And then think of like how few of you have ever heard of him before, right? How influential this has to be on the culture for that much of his work to survive that long, right? Okay, so that's kind of the baseline. There's a lot more of the like dynastic politics of Imperial China at the time that we could unpack that are related to that. But this is a literature class more than a history class. If you're interested in it, by all means, there are an incredible amount of write-ups about it, right? As in all things, when we're looking at them historically, it's good to bounce your understanding of it off of a couple sources. Anything that's a proud historical national tradition tends to get very easily co-opted by propaganda, one way or the other, right? Either pro-Chinese or anti-Chinese propaganda and how it's interpreted. It's up to you to kind of navigate those waters, but there's a lot of interesting historical fact about like what the area looked like at the time, what was happening, and really how it influenced Du Fu as like a person, but also how it played into kind of greater philosophical concerns of China at the time. So that's it for kind of the baseline of who we're talking about here, right? This is by all means not the only translation of Du Fu, obviously, right? This is just a more recent one. I actually picked up my copy over the summer because I saw it came out. I was like, oh, I've vaguely heard the name Du Fu before. I should go and figure out who this person is, and was kind of disappointed and shocked at how little I had been exposed, right? Which is why I'm eager to have you guys be exposed to it as well. The next next lecture in this unit is going to kind of break down some aesthetic and philosophical concerns that come into the criticism of Chinese poetry, right? Namely academic dialogue around it, not whether it's good or bad, not that kind of criticism, right? Where we unpack and come to understand it, but also how that plays into difficulties in translation. All right, so see you guys in the next video.